Good afternoon. This week we have completed the Welsh Government's regular 3-week review of the coronavirus regulations, and this is the third review since we went into the alert level 4 stay-at-home restrictions. Now, of course, a lot has changed since we put these in place to protect the NHS and to save lives in the week before Christmas. At that time, levels of coronavirus were very high and rising in every part of Wales. We'd only just learned about the highly infectious Kent strain of the virus, even though it was already spreading throughout Wales. And we didn't yet know about all the other variants. And back then, we'd only just begun the programme of vaccinating people. Now, the public health situation in Wales has improved significantly, thanks to everything that has been done over the last couple of months. You can see from the slide just how fast things were getting worse before Christmas, but just how far things have improved, and in all parts of Wales as well, since those restrictions were put in place. Cases are now around 84 per 100,000 of the population. Positivity rates are falling. The R number is below 1. And there's evidence that the reductions in the community are now being seen in the NHS. The total number of people in hospital with coronavirus has fallen below 1,800 for the first time since early December. And the number of people with coronavirus needing intensive care is 50% lower than at the peak of the pandemic. At the same time, we're making really good progress with our vaccination programme, thanks to the enormous efforts of all of those involved across Wales. The very latest figures show that almost 840,000 people in Wales have already had their first dose, and that's equivalent to a full third of the adult population of Wales. This week we started offering people appointments for the second dose, and more than 25,000 people have already had theirs. As this graph continues beyond today, we are on track to reach the next milestone, to offer vaccination to everybody in priority groups 5 to 9 by the end of April, provided, of course, that vaccine supplies also remain on course. So the public health position in Wales is improving every day, thanks to the efforts and sacrifices that everybody has made. And this means that we do have some headroom today to make some changes. I said at the end of the last 3-week review in January that if we did have headroom, we would use it to get the youngest children back into school and back into face-to-face learning from next week. We've been working with local education authorities, with teaching and non-teaching staff unions about how we will reopen schools in a phased and flexible way for those youngest children, the foundation phase, from Monday. And I'm very grateful to everyone who's been involved in this work to prepare for the return of face-to-face learning. Getting children back into school remains the Welsh Government's top priority. Now, this means that the overarching stay-at-home measures will need to remain in place for a further 3 weeks. But we can make some further very modest changes to the regulations as we take the first cautious steps to relax a number of the strictest lockdown restrictions we have all been living with for so long. From tomorrow, we will change the rules to allow up to 4 people from 2 different households to exercise outdoors together, helping people who have been struggling with the lockdown. But this does not mean that it is permissible for people to drive somewhere to exercise, and it does mean exercise, not socialising. Sport Wales will now make arrangements for more of our talented athletes to be able to resume training and playing. Next week, we will change the law to allow licensed wedding venues, such as visitor attractions and hotels, to reopen, but only for the purpose of performing weddings and civil partnerships. And as more people are living and working in care homes with the vaccine having been delivered, we will look again at that most difficult and challenging of issues, how to allow more visits in care homes to take place, provided it can be done safely. I want to say something today beyond the next 3 weeks, as we move into the spring and hopefully into better weather and better days. I hope that we will continue to see cases of coronavirus fall across Wales, and we will definitely see more people vaccinated against this terrible virus. But we have all seen, time and again, the world over, just how quickly the situation can change, from promising to very challenging in a matter of a few weeks or even a few days. If we continue to see improvements to the public health situation here in Wales, and if we don't see a further wave of infections caused by any of the new variants circulating in the UK, I want to set out what we will be considering in the next review period. Throughout, we will continue to take a careful and cautious approach, as we have throughout the pandemic, guided by what the expert advisors tell us. The next review of restrictions will be held in 3 weeks' time, in the week beginning the 8th of March. Getting more children and young people back into school and college will continue to be our top priority. And in that context, if things remain on track, our aim will be to have all primary school-aged children returning to face-to-face learning from the 15th of February. And at the same time, to get some older learners, students in years 11 and 13, doing qualifications in school and colleges, getting them back into school and college on a blended learning basis. And if we can lift the stay-at-home requirement in 3 weeks' time, then we will also look to see whether we can begin to reopen some non-essential retail and close contact services such as hairdressing. And looking even beyond the next 3 weeks, we will have discussions now with the tourism sector about what might be possible if the public health circumstances allow. I met our National Tourism Task Force yesterday, and we talked about beginning the reopening of that industry with the self-contained accommodation, as we did when tourism reopened last year. We have all come such a long way together through this pandemic, but we still need your help to keep one another and Wales safe. It's only by working together that we can control the spread of coronavirus in Wales. If we are going to be able, gradually and carefully, to relax restrictions, we have to keep infections as low as we possibly can, because this will help to prevent more new variants emerging. In the meantime, I look forward to seeing the green shoots of spring and the first green shoots of recovery from this awful experience. Diolch yn fawr a diolch o galon I chi gyd. I'll now turn to taking questions as usual, and as usual as well, all the answers will be broadcast on our own social media channels. I'll begin this afternoon with Felicity Evans from BBC Wales.
First Minister, thank you. I'd appreciate it if you could answer in both languages. You talk about relaxing the stay-at-home restrictions, possibly for the next 3-week cycle. Can you give us a sense of what the figures would need to look like in order for you to go ahead with that?
I think the important thing is to say is that the judgment will not just be a mechanical one. It won't be driven simply by, if the number is this, the action will be that. what we will do is to take a judgment in the round informed by the advice of our senior clinicians and scientific advisors. So we will look at all the things that we become familiar with, the number of people per 100,000, that is continuing to decline, the positivity rates are declining, that the R number remains below 1, and that the impact of coronavirus on our hospitals is continuing to reduce. But we will then look at all of that as a package, take advice from those who are responsible for our health service and who model for us the way coronavirus is spreading in Wales. And when we take all of that together, the Cabinet will make a judgment on what is possible in 3 weeks' time. So just i ddweud, ni ddim yn defnyddio'r ffigyrau mewn ffordd sy'n just yn ddweud, os mae'r ffigyrau'n dangos un peth, mae hwnna yn golygu ni'n mynd i wneud rhywbeth penodol. Wrth gwrs, ni'n defnyddio y ffigyrau, faint o bobl sy'n dioddau o coronavirus, beth yw y rif R ac yn y blaen, ond hefyd, ni'n tynnu popeth dy gilydd, gyda cyngor sy'n dod ato ni, gyda'r prif swyddog meddygol pobl sy'n ymgymhori ni ar ochr y gwyddoniaeth. Ac mae'r Cabinet yn ystyried popeth dy gilydd. Ac os mae pethau'n dal i fod ar y llwybr ni'n arno a hyn o bryd, allwn ni edrych ymlaen dros y 2 wythnos nesaf i codi fwy o cyfyngiadau sydd da ni a hyn o bryd.
Thank you. And in the new updated coronavirus control plan that you've published today, you also make it clear that hospitality is still considered a very high-risk sector to reopen, and your failure to mention them today as well also contributes to that sense of them being pretty low down the list in terms of the progress that's made in tackling the virus. What can you say to the sector, given all of that? It looks pretty gloomy for them, doesn't it?
Well, what the sector has said to us is that they would rather know where they stand. When I met with the Tourism Task Force yesterday, there were a number of representatives of the hospitality industry in Wales. And as I explained to them, they are not likely to see a reopening at either of the next 2 3-week review periods. But a lot will happen in that 6 weeks. We will learn a great deal about the impact on the circulation of the virus from reopening schools and any other measures we are able to offer. And provided things continue to improve, then hospitality will come onto the agenda of things we will be able to consider next. But the industry was clear. What they didn't want was to be left in the dark. And that's why I was clear with them. The next 6 weeks, our priorities will continue to be children and education, whether it's possible to reopen some non-essential retail, if there is any prospect of even a modest resumption in the tourism industry. Those will be our plan over the weeks to come. Hospitality, if we can accomplish that successfully, then their turn will come as well. So, just i ddweud, pan oeddwn ni'n cwrdd ddoe gyda'r tasglu sy'n gweithio gyda ni yma yng Nghymru, oedd nifer o bobl yn y maes llatigarwch yn y cyfarfod, beth oedden nhw'n ddweud yw, oedden nhw'n eisiau gwybod ble ydyn nhw. A beth dwi wedi ddweud heddi, a beth wedais i iddyn nhw ddoe yw, dydy llatigarwch ddim ar y rester o bethau ni'n mynd i ystyried dros y 2 wythnos ar y 6 wythnos sydd o flaen ni. Mae blaenoriaethau sydd da ni yw yr un dwi wedi dangos prynhawn ma. Ysgolion a phlant, os mae'n posib i ail agor siopau, os mae posibiliadau i ddechrau y proses o ail agor pethau yn y maes twristiaeth. Ar ôl hynny, os ni'n llwyddo i wneud hynny, ac os mae'r ffigyrau'n dal i fynd i lawr, wrth gwrs, mae lletygarwch yn pwysig i ni ac allwn ni gweithio gyda'r y sector i weld beth sy'n bosibl os mae pethau'n dal yn mynd yn y gyfeiriad gywir. Firstly, thank you very much. Over to Adrian Masters at ITV Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. I'd like to ask you about hospitality as well. As you can probably tell, I'm at a pub in Cardiff. Sadly, there's no beer in the pumps and no people here, and they understand the difficult decisions you have to make and the uncertainty around that. But the landlord here, Gareth, has told me that a report from UK Hospitality Wales shows that hospitality is one of the sectors least responsible for transmission of the virus. And yet there has been no mention of hospitality today, as you've already alluded to. Are you and your government listening to the concerns and the advice of UK Hospitality Wales?
Well, of course, we are keen to listen and engage and talk with the sector. But I just have to explain to them, as I do to many other businesses, which of course are desperately anxious to be able to resume, that the only way we will succeed in getting them back trading is if we approach the reopening of our economy and our society in a way that is careful, that is step by step, and allows us always to review the impact of any actions we take on the circulation of the virus. Too much, too soon, will simply return us to those very difficult days we saw on the first graph that we were facing before Christmas. The other thing that the hospitality industry said to me yesterday, Adrian, is what they don't want is stop-start. They don't want to be able to reopen and then find that because the virus gets a grip again, everything has got to close. So while, of course, we listen carefully and as soon as conditions allow, we'll want to see the sector get back into action, I think they understand that in the long term, it is better for them and for us all to do this in a way in which progress can be properly sustained.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask another question on behalf of somebody else that we're filming with today, who is Lara Johnson, who's a hairdresser in Swansea. And I'm sure she's grateful to hear what you've said about her sector. But as she says that as neither leisure or hospitality, the hairdressing sector doesn't always get the same level of support that businesses in those other sectors do. Will you look again at help for small businesses like Lara's, which may fall through the net?
I think hairdressers, in fact, have had very considerable support through the Welsh Government. If you are a hairdresser on the high street, you will certainly have benefited from all the small business rate relief and other packages that we've put together. And if you're a sole trader, then there have been special schemes that the Welsh Government has provided as well. But I know that what business in Wales want is not more money from the government. What they want is to be able to open and have a thriving business in the way that they had this time last year. And I've indicated today that we will be talking with non-essential retail and those personal services that have been closed at the moment to see if it's possible for anything to resume in 3 weeks' time. Last time we opened hairdressers first, and then other services of the same sort, the nail bars and so on, followed a couple of weeks later. And I think I'm keen to learn the lessons of last year, to do the things that worked well then, and where we can do things better, to do things better also. But there's quite a lot of us, even looking around the room here, who are looking forward to the opportunity of having a haircut again. Adrian, thank you. Adam Hale, PA.
Well, Prif Weinidog, you said this morning you would want to continue protecting areas of Wales with low levels of the virus from others which have high levels. Are we looking at with the potential now for easing of travel rules around Easter, continuing with travel bans in places elsewhere in the UK if they have a tier system in place, or are you considering another system of preventing travel from particular areas that might pose a threat?
No, I think we developed over last year a number of ways in which we were able to reduce the flow of traffic from high incidence areas to low incidence areas. And that's always been what I have wanted to achieve. I've many times said here, the border is not the issue. The issue is trying to make sure that coronavirus doesn't get seeded again in low incidence areas. So as we move ahead and as we get to the point where we are able to resume travel, in Wales. That will be one of the principles that we will use to make those decisions, and if it's necessary to enforce those decisions, if we had wide disparities between the position we face in Wales and the position elsewhere, then we will act again to make sure that low incidence areas in Wales do not face influxes of people from areas where travelling to Wales would mean bringing the virus with you.
I'm sure you'll be aware of a high-profile murder trial that took place in Swansea Crown Court this past week, which concluded with a man being convicted of manslaughter for killing his wife in Cymru during the first lockdown. The sentence he's received has led to a sizable outcry from people across the UK, and now a group of Labour MPs are saying that they're writing to the Attorney General to refer it to the Court of Appeal. Now it's left court. Do you sympathise with those who have concerns about this case? And what message do you have to women who, because of lockdowns and because of stay-at-home rules, are at the moment at greater risk of domestic abuse?
Well, Adam, on the first part of that question, I don't think it is sensible for me to be drawn into commenting on decisions that are there for the criminal justice system to make. We've seen other people get into trouble just this week for commenting in ways that appears to try to influence that process. So I'm not going to be drawn into that. On the second part of your question, though, of course, anybody in Wales who during this lockdown period finds that they are at additional risk of domestic violence, I want them to know that the services are there to help protect them. And I know that it can be difficult to get to those services, but there are ways in which signals of distress can be communicated. Our police force in Wales remains ready to intervene where necessary. Our specialist services for domestic violence, the helpline, the other services that the Welsh Government fund are there as well. This is an issue that has been regularly highlighted during the whole of nearly 12 months, and I really want people in Wales to know, if you yourself are in that position, or if you think you know of somebody who may need that help is there, and there are ways in which you can get it. Adam, diolch yn fawr. Over to Will Hayward at Wales Online.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Can I ask you about exercise? Why can't people drive in order to exercise now, even just a small distance, especially those in areas without a park nearby or who live just out of walking distance of their family? And just also on exercise, could I ask you about gyms? Leonard Morgan has indicated that they'd be one of the first places to be considered due to the mental and physical health benefits. But the Technical Advisory Cell has said that they can cause super spreading events. When will gyms be considered for reopening? Could it be possibly at Easter?
Okay, well, thank you. So the reason why at this point we are not allowing people to travel in their cars for exercise is because you will remember all the scenes we saw not that long ago of what happens at beauty spots when people think that that option is open to them. We get large congregations of people in relatively confined spaces with all the risks that that brings. Now, if you are someone with a disability, or if the only way you can get exercise is by travelling in your car to somewhere suitable, then that is allowed within the rules. But for people who don't face those barriers, for now, then it is a matter of exercising from your own front door and returning to it. I hope, with all the ifs that I always have to emphasise, that this may be the last 3 weeks of the stay-at-home restrictions, because we would all like to be able to do more than we are doing now. But while we continue to see further progress necessary, then 3 weeks more of staying at home will have to be the rule for us all. In terms of the second part of the question, which I've temporarily mislaid.
Which was on gyms.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, look, as you said, Cynhadledd pointed to the mental health advantage of people being able to use gyms. She's the mental health minister in the government. We've now had this further advice from our technical advisory group. Their anxiety is that the Kent variant, which is so much more transmissible, so much more infectious than the original form of coronavirus, that may make gyms particularly vulnerable to being places where the virus is spread. So I don't anticipate that we will see gyms reopening, certainly not in the next 3 weeks, but the evidence will accumulate. The evidence will accumulate over the weeks ahead as we gradually allow more things to happen, whether or not allowing people to get together with the new Kent variant will lead to the virus coming back at a very quick rate. If it doesn't, then the Technical Advisory Group will revisit its advice and we will see what might be able to be done. You know, I acknowledge everything that Cynhadledd said about exercise, leisure centres, gyms. It isn't just physical fitness, it's mental well-being as well. At the moment, the advice is we must be precautionary and we mustn't put that at the front of the queue, and therefore we will not be able to do that until better evidence emerges.
Okay, so it's fair to say definitely not at the next 3-week review, but could be under consideration if cases stay low at the next one, but still depends on cases. If some accommodation does reopen by Easter, is it fair to assume that there will not be any restrictions on travel in 6 weeks' time? Also, if the stay-home message is ending in 3 weeks, are we looking at a potential return to the 5-mile rule? And if so, would that only be for the 3 weeks leading up to Easter?
Look, all of those I think are proper questions. You're right. If we were to be able to reopen self-contained accommodation at Easter, then a stay-at-home rule would not work. People would have to be able to travel to it. So the two things do go together in that way. And if this were to be the final 3 weeks of the stay-at-home message, then there will be choices for government to make at the end of those 3 weeks. Whether we go back to people being able to travel anywhere in Wales, or whether we would have an intermediate stage of a stay local period as we did last year. At this point, those are genuinely open questions, but they are questions that we will have to grapple with over the next 3 weeks if we are fortunate enough to be in a position 3 weeks from now where we can go beyond the stay-at-home message. Well, thank you. Over to Dan Bevan at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. You've said previously that you're going to unlock cautiously from this lockdown, more cautiously than you did last summer. But in your opening statement, you said that in 3 weeks' time, there could be scope for both non-essential retail and close contact services to begin to open. Now, those things opened 3 weeks apart last year in June and July. So will the return look the same as it did last year, or will there be extra measures in place than there were last year?
Well, I don't think it will look identical because, as I've said, I'm keen to learn the lessons of last year, look at what was effective, look where we can do things better. And you did, Dan, faithfully reflect what I said, but I'm going to re-emphasise it for people, that what we're looking at is the start of the reopening of those sectors. That is not to say that I'm likely to be able to say that everything, every business right across the board of non-essential retail and personal services will all be able to reopen on the first day in every part of Wales. And so, we're talking about a path in which we build things up and do things gradually. And we'll do it thinking about last time's experience, but of course in the circumstances we're in. We're at a tipping point, aren't we? This is why the judgments are so challenging. On the one hand, we have things that are better than last year with vaccination and lateral flow devices and the actions we've learnt over the time. On the other side of the ledger, we've got new variants. We've got more infectious forms of coronavirus. It's going to be a continuous matter of weighing all of that up and then taking the steps we are able to take one at a time in a careful way and learning as we go along.
Thank you. And when speaking with James O'Brien on LBC this morning, you said things aren't going to be back to normal this year. At least you couldn't see that being the case, which will come as a concern to many small businesses, particularly in the hospitality industry. Now, I've spoken with one restaurant owner this morning who's decided to close their business permanently because they say the restrictions in place, in particular, to social distancing, it has made their business unviable. If rates get as low as they were in the summer, could you, by any chance, consider some form of restriction easing in that sense, perhaps even a 1 metre plus, as is the case across the border? Or are you ruling that out entirely?
No, I'm certainly not ruling anything out entirely. James O'Brien asked me whether I thought that by the end of this calendar year, coronavirus will be completely over and we'd be back living as though it wasn't part of our lives. And I'm afraid that I don't think it will be like that. We're going to be living with coronavirus one way or another throughout the rest of this calendar year. And that means there will be some adaptations, even in the best of circumstances. There will be some adaptations we will all continue to have to make. So I think it's much too early to anticipate the way in which we will be able to respond to the impact of vaccinating the whole of the adult population, what that will do for us against some of the risks we know that will be there. If we could get back to the way that things were in the summer, and we could get back to that earlier in this year, I think that will be a very good platform from which to try to bring about further easements. But we're not at that point yet. To Mark Hutchins at 5 Live.
Thanks very much indeed. If you work in non-essential retail, you might be wondering what you mean exactly by the start of the reopening of non-essential retail and also close contact services. So can you expand on that a bit? What might open and what might not?
Well, if you're wondering in the sector, then the best thing will be that to explain that we're going to have conversations with the sector over the weeks ahead to work through this with them in detail. I don't think it is for government to just be able to make the decisions for everybody. We want to make those decisions with other people. So just as I've explained already, last year we reopened hairdressers before we opened other close contact services. And I think it's likely that we would want to have a similar sort of phased approach to that. In relation to non-essential retail, well, Mark, think of the way that things have happened in the reopening of schools as of next Monday. We said there would be a week of flexibility. That means that some local authorities will have all their schools open as of Monday. Some others, particularly in North Wales, where the numbers continue to be more challenging, have decided to use that week and to phase children back more slowly. So I'm just pointing to the fact that we will need some flexibility in all of this. We will need to have a discussion with the sector itself, and then we will all want to do it in the way that is as safe for people to return as possible. Because the other thing we learned last year is that if people don't think it's safe to go somewhere, they don't go there anyway, and that's not good for business.
And on the subject of sport, next weekend, many of us may be sitting on our sofa watching Wales-England in the Six Nations or other live sport, and yet a group of children can't go for a kickabout in the park, people can't play tennis or golf for healthy outdoor exercise. Isn't it time to end this idea that sport is the preserve of the elite?
Well, I'm very keen to be able to allow children particularly to resume outdoor exercise and activity. Our top priority for the moment is getting children back into school. And we will have to carefully, that's what we have agreed with our local education authorities and teaching unions, we will have to carefully observe the evidence of what that does to the transmission of the disease. But if we can have a successful return to school, as I hope we will, and we've worked very hard, everybody has worked very hard to create the conditions for that, then beyond that, I am very keen indeed to allow those young people to do more in the outdoors in the way that was possible earlier last year. I'm very familiar with the long list of activities that people write to us about. Why not tennis? Why not golf? Why not fishing? Why not pigeon racing? Why not? You know, it's a long list. The problem is every activity you add gives the virus another opportunity to circulate. And the more you add incrementally by themselves, they may hardly seem to add anything. But everything adds something, and by the time you've added them all up, you find the virus is thriving and getting away from us again. And that's what I have to keep trying to explain to people. It's the cumulative impact of all of these things we have to be aware of, not just the single strands. Mark, thank you. Draw I Lydia Griffith at S4C.
Diolch, Prif Weinidog. Heddiw yma, 20 o gyrff iechyd cenedlaethol wedi galw ar y Prif Weinidog Boris Johnson I wella ansawdd PPE I weithwyr iechyd. Maen nhw'n dweud fod tua 930 o weithwyr iechyd wedi marw Covid-19 yn y Deyrnas Unedig. Beth mae Llywodraeth Cymru yn ei wneud I sicrhau fod PPE yn ddigonol I weithwyr iechyd yma yng Nghymru?
Diolch, Lydia. Wel, ni wedi gweithio'n galed dros y cyfnod coronavirus I gyd. Dyn ni byth wedi redeg mas o PPE o gwbl yma yng Nghymru. A mae grŵp o bobl sy'n arbenigwyr yn y maes sy'n ymgymhori ni am y safon a'r ansawdd o PPE ni'n rhoi I bobl am hob sector, yn ysbytau, yn y maes gofal ac yn y blaen. Nifer o weithiau yn ystod y pandemig, mae nhw'n wedi rhoi cyngor iddyn ni I ddweud mae'n well I ni newid be ni'n rhoi I bobl. I bod yn glir, mae hwnna'n digonol I warchod nhw rhag ofn coronavirus. Os mae nhw'n dod ato ni fel Llywodraeth ac yn ddweud, nawr yw yr amser I newid beth ni'n rhoi mas I bobl, wel dyna'r y cyngor ni'n mynd I dderbyn. Dydy nhw ddim wedi ddweud hynny ato ni a hyn o bryd, ond mae nhw'n cadw y tystiolaeth dan sylw bob wythnos. So Lydia was asking me about the call from some health bodies for a higher standard of PPE in some contexts within the health service. And I was just explaining that we have an expert group that we have established here in Wales that advises the Welsh Government on the quality and the standard of PPE that we provide, not just in the health service, but in all other settings as well. There have been moments during the pandemic when they have advised us to change the type of PPE we are providing to make it more effective. We've always followed their advice. If they were to advise us that further changes were needed, then that is what we had to do. That is what we would do. But we've not had that advice from them at this point.
Diolch I chi. Ac at addysg nesaf, os gwelwch yna, da chi wedi gwrthod galwadau gan athrawon I gael y frechlyn yn erbyn Covid-19 yn y gorffennol. Sut all athrawon fod â sicrwydd eu bod nhw'n mynd I fod yn saff yn dysgu wyneb yn wyneb a hynny heb gael y frechlyn?
Wel, fel dwi wedi esbonio nifer o weithiau, ni'n dilyn y cyngor sy'n dod ato ni o'r y pwyllgor, y JCVI, y pwyllgor sy'n ymgymhori bob llywodraeth yn y Deyrnas Unedig. Mae nhw'n ystyried yr achos ar ôl ni'n cwblhau y 5 grwpiau nesaf, os bydd y ffordd gorau ymlaen yw I troi at grwpiau o bobl mewn proffesiynol fel athrawon, ond mae rester hir hefyd ar heddlu, pobl sy'n gweithio yn siopa, pobl sy'n gyrru bwsys a taxis ac yn y blaen. Y JCVI yw y grŵp gorau I ystyried hwnna, a ni'n just mynd ar ôl y cyngor maen nhw'n rhoi ato ni. Beth ni wedi wneud dros yr wythnosau diwetha yw I gweithio'n galed, gyda'r undebau, gyda'r awdurdodau lleol. Ni wedi rhoi fwy o pethau yn ei le, yn ein ysgolion, I roi hyder i'r athrawon. Mae'n saff I mynd nôl I ddysgu plant wyneb a wyneb. A ni'n hyderus nawr mae pethau go iawn da ni, a mae hyder yn gallu fod yna. Lydia asking me about the issue of vaccination for teachers and the measures that are in place to make the classroom a safe place for teachers to feel confident to return. I explained, as I have a number of times, that the Welsh Government, as does every other government in the United Kingdom, follows the advice of the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. They are considering whether, once the next 5 priority groups are completed, they should move to a register based on professional groups, not just teachers, of course. There's a strong case to be made by other professions, the police, shop workers, taxi drivers, bus drivers, and others too. If the advice of the JCVI moves in that direction, that is what we will follow here in Wales. In the meantime, we have worked very hard with the trade unions and with the local education authorities to put new safeguards in place as teachers return to face learning. And we funded that £5 million additional from the Welsh Government to fund those new safeguards. I am confident that schools are safe places for teachers to return to face-to-face learning, and I know many, many of them are looking forward very much to being back in the classroom where they feel they belong and with the children whose well-being and whose education matters so much to them. Lydia, diolch yn fawr. Thomas Moody of the South Wales Argus.
Good afternoon, First Minister. I'm sure many people will be glad to hear your plan for getting all students back into school after the next review date. Is the Welsh Government in discussions with school leaders, local authorities, teaching unions on what can be done to support older pupils who might be, because of the challenges of learning from home, they might be behind on what they need to know ahead of moving up to university or moving up to college?
Yes, Thomas, thank you. Those are very important points. And yes, indeed, we are in very continuous conversations with school leaders, education authorities, college leaders as well, both in order to try and create conditions in which more children can return to school, but also to think of what we can do to help children and young people make up for some of the gaps that may have emerged in their learning as a result of the extraordinary circumstances we've been in. The Welsh Government announced 29 million in additional investment in the further education sector just a couple of weeks ago. And that is partly to help with physical changes and adaptations, but it's also to allow for some of that catch-up activity to take place. We'd already announced money for the school sector, and I think our education authorities have worked incredibly hard to get over 1,000 extra staff appointed to do catch-up activity with children in the position exactly as you described, people who want to go on further in education and now need to make sure that they've got the platform behind them to allow them to do that successfully.
Thank you. And over the last few weeks, ministers have been asking the public to bear with us a few weeks more with the lockdown. And today you said the stay-at-home rules could be removed after 3 weeks. But again, this is far from concrete. I appreciate it's difficult to give any sort of firm dates on things like this. But would it be more useful for people to know or for it to be announced as the worst case scenario and brought forward rather than saying it could happen and then pushing it back?
Well, I could see a case for doing things that way. But what I hear from people who contact us is that this has been a long, exhausting process. And people do need to have some sense that all their efforts are going to bear some fruit. And hope is an important part of the human condition, isn't it? The hope that things can get better, that we can look forward to things improving. So I could say, indeed, this is the worst. It could have gone like this for a long time yet. On the whole, I think that is not the easiest way to help people to get through the experience we're all living through together. I want to be able to indicate where things can improve and the timescale against which that could happen, while having always to be realistic with people. This is what can happen provided things continue to improve. If we were knocked off course by a different variant of the virus or something else that we haven't been able to foresee, things may not be as good as I've been able to lay out today. But we've had a very good period since Christmas. You saw the figures earlier on. the pace at which they have improved, the rate at which vaccination has rolled out across Wales. If we can keep that up, then things can improve, and they can improve in 3 weeks from now. Thomas, thank you. Over to Tom Magna at Carers World.
Thank you, First Minister. Our viewers are certainly impressed by the speed of vaccine rollout, and you're nearly on the verge of band 6 first vaccinations. But nevertheless, worry does still remain. After 4 weeks, unpaid carers still do not appear to have been included in the main wording of band 6, so public information remains out of date. There's no apparent published plan to priority stream within band 6. And you've used the word flexibility on occasions. Some of our viewers are thinking that may mean opening the door to unpaid carers being made to wait for their first jab, perhaps push back behind professional groups by a change in JCVI advice. Isn't this all a picture of failure of the Welsh Government and statutory bodies across Wales to get ahead beyond a general expression that unpaid carers are having to prove they're looking after a friend or relative? And can you do all of this for unpaid carers before the Wales vaccination strategy plan target for all 9 bands by the end of April?
Well, we definitely will intend to complete all of band 6, including all the unpaid carers contained within that, by the end of April. They are very firmly in our plan for that. When I talk about flexibility, I certainly don't mean that we will suddenly introduce new groups who will get ahead of others who are already waiting for their vaccination. I simply mean that we want to continue the fantastic success we've had of not wasting any vaccine here in Wales. You know that the Pfizer vaccine cannot be preserved overnight once it's started to be used. That does mean that sometimes at the end of the day, we have to call some people in at very short notice to make sure that that vaccine gets put to good use. That's what I meant by flexibility, that we don't waste things because we've got an over-rigid process. Now, next week, my colleague Vaughan Gethin will set out in fuller detail how unpaid carers and that group 6 in the next 5 priority groups are going to be treated here in Wales. And he was in a meeting with the other UK health ministers yesterday to try to make sure that as much as possible we have a common approach to this across the whole of the United Kingdom. And while I understand absolutely that people will be frustrated at not having all the detail they would like, there is more detail coming and it will be available next week.
Thank you for that, and we look forward to hearing further next week. You mentioned in your opening statement, or in answer to one of the other questions, that you wanted to learn the lessons of last year. One of the key features seems to be the vast majority of unpaid carers, officially 2/3 of carers in Wales, they work to fund their support for a friend or relative at home. They're at working age, so they haven't had their first jab yet, and may well be going back home at night to a vulnerable person who has not had that first jab. I'm thinking particularly of people with learning disabilities here. Isn't it time to bring clarity and certainty by urgently creating a national unpaid carers register of all ages, not only to speed up first vaccination, but make it easier and more efficient for second vaccination and beyond to the expected booster jab? Thank you.
Well, Tom, thank you very much. I'm probably not myself close enough to the detail to understand the arguments for, and no doubt there will be some reservations as well about an unpaid carers register. But part of the work that's been going on over recent weeks about Group 6 is indeed to find a way of identifying unpaid carers, and there isn't a single source that you can go to for that. So I'm very happy to take up that point, put it to my colleague Julie Morgan, who is closer to the detail of all of this than I would be, and to ask her to explore the case, including with Carers World themselves, so we can learn more about how such a register might be created and what would need to lie behind it. Thank you very much. Go to Alan Evans at Llanelli Online.
Thank you, First Minister, for this question. I'm assuming you're a music fan. There is a song by the Rag and Bone Man, and the lyrics include the lines, "Some people got real problems, some people out of luck, Some people think I can solve them. Lord heavens above, I'm only human after all. Don't put the blame on me. The blame is being heaped on you by your political opponents. Fail, fail, fail is the cry from Adam Price and his shadow ministers and other politicians within the Senedd. Do you accept some of that blame? Does the assassination have an effect on you personally? And do you expect a backlash from the people of Wales at the election in May?
Alan, I am a music fan. I'm not as familiar with Rag and Bone Man as maybe I ought to be. But thank you for the lyrics. Look, the job of opposition parties is to scrutinise the government. In a national crisis, I think sensible oppositions try to do that in a constructive way. I don't think blame is a particularly helpful way of trying to get us all through the crisis. And quite honestly, I don't think it resonates with the public as well. The public expect politicians to try and work together as much as possible in order to combat a common crisis. And I meet every week with the leader of Plaid Cymru and the leader of the opposition, the Conservative Party. And if I don't meet them, a colleague of mine from the Cabinet does, to try to keep them in touch with the evidence that we are seeing. Do attacks have an effect on me personally? Well, I just think it's just part of the job, really, isn't it? So long as I can get up in the morning and know that I myself am doing the job as best I can, and at the end of the day think I've done the best that I can for people in Wales, then that allows me to carry on. What people in Wales will make when they go to the ballot box in May, it will be for them to decide. On the whole, I think we've continued to secure the support of the bulk of mainstream opinion here in Wales behind the way that the Welsh Government has dealt with this pandemic. And the pandemic will not be over after May. And I think many people will, stare at the ballot paper and ask themselves whether they think that this is the right moment to be changing governments during a continued public health crisis.
I'm not sure how things are in Cardiff, but here in Llanelli and Carmarthenshire, people are queuing up at makeshift centres waiting for appointments for simple things like blood tests and having to travel, waiting in the cold, being asked to shout one's personal information through a tannoy system outside surgeries. If you're lucky and you own a car, you can shelter there for the time it takes to be seen. Is this as good as it gets in Wales? Isn't more investment in these services, GP surgeries, community clinics, district nurses, building a stronger, better health service to deal with what maybe, as you have said there at the end of that first answer, could be the normal for years to come?
Well, I definitely agree that more investment is going to be needed in the health service. The health service has a recovery period in front of it as well. We know that coronavirus has meant that things that normally the health service would have done have not been possible. We know that the staff in the health service themselves are going to need a period of recovery from the enormous stresses and strains they've been under. So more investment, yes, absolutely, to put that health service back on its feet and to be fit for the future. In the interim, I was speaking to some people from Carmarthen yesterday, as it happens, having some connections in that part of the world, and they were explaining to me how they'd gone for vaccination. And actually, they both reported it being a very smooth, very well organised service. I know myself, if I go to the doctor, luckily I don't need to do it, but if I go to my own GP, you do have to wait outside. In the current circumstances, they are having to take extra precautions to make sure that the service is being safely offered, and that means you can't sit in a waiting room with lots of other people who are ill. So I'm afraid there are some accommodations that are just necessary given the scale of the problem that we face. The future needs to be one of proper investment, proper recovery, and a health service which has demonstrated over the last 12 months its fundamental worth in the lives of us all.
Yeah.
Diolch, Alun. And last of all, finally to Rob Taylor at Wrexham.com.
Good afternoon. Picking up your comments earlier on how wide disparities in the future could be dealt with, With a higher background community transmission in Wrexham and Flintshire, what makes you confident that staged reopen policy for all of Wales will not result in those areas re-entering the localised lockdowns first?
Well, the confidence I have is that numbers in that part of Wales are also coming down alongside everybody else. The trajectory has been different, as we've discussed here a number of times, with, to begin with, numbers lower in North Wales and then moving higher when other parts of Wales were already being able to reduce. But the pattern is the same everywhere. It's the pattern we saw on that first slide. North Wales, along everywhere else, is seeing those numbers come down, the positivity rates coming down, the impact on health services coming down. So long as we can continue that journey, then Wrexham and Flintshire are on it as well, and we will hope that they can be included in the strategy that we've set out today for moving beyond the current level of restrictions.
Thank you. And the Police Federations of Wales have written to you asking about police vaccinations, and you've touched on the JCVI lists and future assessments on professions. But is there anything that can be done now within your gift without going outside that framework? For example, make them eligible and priority for, as you said, the end of the day spares?
Well, a number of health boards have indeed done that, because sometimes you need to be able to call people in very short periods of time, because for good reasons, appointments get cancelled. The Pfizer vaccine, particular whole batches have been opened, and the police service is one of the places you can sometimes go to and get people in contact with them quickly and get them to come and take up vaccination. And in that pragmatic way, in that, making sure things don't go to waste, health boards have vaccinated a number of police officers. And I am relaxed about that. I think that is just sensible local management of the complexity of the vaccination programme. What I'm not going to be able to do is to move police officers, teachers, taxi drivers, shop workers, all the people who by themselves can make a good case out of the JCVI list and to the top of the priority order. If the JCVI tells us that that's what we should do, that is what we will do. Up until then, we will stick with the 9 priority groups and put all our efforts into completing the vaccination of all of those people. And, it's 1.8 million people we've got to get through to get those 5 groups done by the end of April. Rob, thank you. Thanks to everybody this afternoon.